Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome back Gareth Russell to discuss his new book, Queen James. Gareth Russell is a historian, broadcaster, and author of several books, including the best-selling The Palace, From the Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of History at Hampton Court, and Young and Damned and Fair, his biography of Queen Catherine Howard, and most recently, Queen James, exploring the life of Britain's first king and the 6 loves of his life. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Gareth. How are you?
Very well, Jess. Thanks so much for having me back.
I've been very excited for this, I can't lie.
Thank
Um,
you.
I've loved the book. It's a masterpiece.
That's immensely kind of you to say. Thank you very much.
So I wanted to ask if you would reintroduce yourself for the listeners that have not heard our previous episode on Catherine Howard.
Yeah, my name is Gareth Russell. As Jess just mentioned, I've been on the podcast before to talk about Catherine Howard, who I did my postgraduate thesis on my first full-length biography, Young and Damned and Fair. I'm a historian and broadcaster, and my most recent book, which we're here to talk about, is Queen James, The Life and Loves of Britain's First King, which will be out in America later in the year with the title The Six Loves of James the First.
What was the inspiration for this book? How did you come onto the topic of this?
By accident, or probably it always looks like accident in hindsight. So my previous book was called The Palace, and it was about Hampton Court, and it was a different person, different decade, different room going through the history of the palace. The book's called The Palace, and there were 3 chapters in it that were focusing on incidents that had happened at Hampton Court when James the First was King of England. And the reading around him and his life that I did for that was so interesting that I thought I wish I could spend more time on him here, but I need to keep going. And I had wrapped that book up and I went to a friend's house for a weekend or to visit, and someone who was also there was the novelist Elizabeth Fremantle. And many people will know her. She was the author who wrote the novel behind the movie Firebrand. She's written a lot of really brilliant books in the 17th century too, including one about James's favorite Robert Carr. And we were talking about it, and I said that I felt that, there was still a lot more that I could have said about James. And it was Elizabeth that was who said, I think, it's time that there was a book that looked at James through the prism of the men he loved, in the same way we've had such rich writing about Henry VIII through the 6 women he loved. And she said, I think you're the one to do it, which is really kind. And that sort of stuck with me. So when it came time to decide what the next book was, those 2 things collided and made James seem like the obvious choice.
I think it is a really interesting approach because, as you say, Henry VIII is always brought up, and it's always through his 6 wives now, which is interesting. But these 6 men, where he doesn't just execute them when he's fed up of them, which is refreshing for
Yeah.
once.
Yes, it's one of many ways James was a nicer person to spend company with than Henry VIII in terms of writing about them.
Moving on to James himself, he had quite a turbulent childhood, to say the least.
Yeah, he did. He was the son of Mary Queen of Scots and her English husband, Lord Darnley. And when he was 13 months old, his father was murdered very famously in the Kirkfield explosion, although he actually escaped the explosion and was found strangled in the gardens later. And a bit like a good murder mystery, there were so many suspects because everyone had a motive. But one of the people who had a motive was James's mother, Mary, and whether she was or was not involved continues to divide scholars. It didn't really seem to divide a lot of people in Scotland at the time, at least certainly not her enemies, who used it to push her off the throne. Many of her supporters actually thought she might have been involved in it as well and thought that was absolutely fair if she had been. But when there were other people who thought she'd been framed. From James's perspective, it meant that, by the time he was a child, by the time he was um, not yet, he just turned a year old, sorry, excuse me, when all this drama is kicking off and he is crowned king in the summer of 1567. And he obviously as a baby, he's too young to walk and talk, let alone to rule Scotland. Sorry, I should say it was 13 months old when he becomes King of Scots, King James the Sixth. And he's sent to Stirling, which is one of the most impressive historical homes I've ever visited. It's absolutely astonishing. And there really is such a sense of what it looked like in the 16th century when he was sent there. And whilst he was a child, there were various regents, usually relatives of his, on the male side, who ruled Scotland in his name. And in some ways, the childhood at Stirling was more happy than a lot of people would suspect, in that he did have three tutors who were very kind. One of his language tutors, a man called Peter Young, and two of his physical educators, Adam Erskine and David Erskine, who he got on very well with. He had a governess whom he just adored called the Countess of Mar. He called her Lady Minnie, which is a 16th century Scottish colloquialism for mummy. So in many ways, he grew, while he never saw his mother again after um, he was 10 months old. He had a mother figure, which was Lady Minnie. But there was quite the fly in the ointment in the form of his senior tutor, a man called George Buchanan, who, even within the context of the 16th century, in which corporal punishment of children was encouraged, was judged by some people at Stirling to be physically excessive to the point of abusive in how he quote unquote disciplined James. And there were stories I came across of the governess Lady Marr having to barge into the schoolroom and pull Buchanan off James with the beatings he was administering. There's a long-standing myth. It's told about Edward the Sixth and Charles the First, and people assume it existed, that there was something called a whipping boy, and that the kings and princes and princesses were not physically beaten by their tutors, and that there was a servant who stood in to take the the um the caning or the beating for them. That is not true. That never existed. Royal children were beaten. And it was part of an argument that gave birth to a very common saying. It was spoil the rod. Sorry, spare the rod, spoil the child. And also, you didn't want a king who couldn't handle physical pain, particularly since there was still a chance he might need to go to war. So James was like many royal children, but like children throughout society in the 16th century, he was physically disciplined, but in a way to us that would seem excessive. But even within context, what Buchanan did to him was excessive. And even when he was in his 40s, sometimes he would be thinking about Buchanan and start to tremble. But the other thing that was traumatic for him was, along with this mixture of affection and abuse, and also, it has to be said, a really excellent intellectual education. He was extremely bright. He does increasingly witness quite a bit of political turmoil when he's a child. He sees the death of his grandfather, the Earl of Lennox. He's shot in the back at Stirling and is carried past James as he's sort of going into his death throes. Lady Mar does her level best to keep politics at bay. And she does this. Actually, in many ways, she is remarkable at this. But as James starts to go through puberty, and there's really an interesting legal point, which is at 12, he's considered halfway to adulthood. For British listeners, probably the closest legal equivalent that we would have today is 16, which is that certain rights are, you have some of them, but 18 is full adulthood. So, you can, I mean, here in Northern Ireland, you can start preparing for your driving test at 17, etc. So there are different, that's roughly the equivalent. And James, by that point, cannot be shielded from politics. And he starts to endure, I think, an overlooked period in his life, which is a really traumatic adolescence and early teenage years, in which he At one point he has an almost surrogate grandfather figure, Lord Athol, who dies quite suddenly. I think probably of natural causes, but it's suspiciously soon after a banquet. James becomes fearful it might have been poison. Lord Athol's widow is convinced it's poison. And he comes to really fear his last regent, a man called Lord Morton. And what James tries to do in his early teens is build up a family network. There really hasn't been an extended royal family in Scotland for a long time because of the chaos of his mother's reign and his grandmother's regency. Not all of it their fault, it has to be said. It was simply a tumultuous time for the royal family in Scotland and the monarchy in general. But James is trying to build up a family network that will provide him both emotional and political support. And he starts to make a play to become not pawn but king at the heart of government. And because of this, he is thrust really into a very brutal world in which he will endure the threat and often the reality of kidnapping. He will feel his life is at threat on several occasions, and he will learn that in order to survive, he has to become a very good liar.
No, completely. I mean, when I was reading about the tutor, I mean, pardon my language, what an arse he was.
Buchanan, yeah.
It's absolutely terrible. I mean, I was shocked that the king was beaten, but as you say, like Edward the Sixth, it's like it was normal to
Yeah.
build up strength, so to speak.
The reason why I think we always have to be careful with using concepts like abuse is, yeah, people can project modern values back onto it, but there's also an overcorrection there where sometimes people are reluctant to ever say that an act of brutality was brutal, even by the standards of the time. So I try to say, look at, if there are members of the household having to break into the schoolroom and pull him off James, and the sound of James's screams have reached other parts of the castle, then clearly within context, this is regarded as brutally excessive.
Would you say that James becomes quite politically savvy from 12 when he starts going into politics more himself?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I would agree with that. He does. There are mistakes. It's a learning curve. There'll be mistakes until the day he dies, almost, and that, I mean, that's true. Even if and I think he was an excellent. He was a very savvy politician. I think that is a good way to put it. And you pick up at 12, 13, he's telling outright lies to the Regent Lord Morton and saying, I wish you were younger so you could stay in government longer, even while he's clearly plotting to get rid of him. But he had to be. They all were. And I made this point a few years ago when I was working on another book about the medieval monarchy, and I think I was talking about Margaret Beaufort and Richard III and that generation. And I'm not convinced you find many heroes or saints in that generation. I think if you are brought up in a world that's on fire, you become a very different and often difficult person. And that's not to say there weren't admirable traits. I mean, James certainly had many, but honesty was not one of them. And in fact, I was increasingly glad that I had picked his romances as a framing device because it was in his private letters to these men that he was completely honest in a way that he wasn't politically. So that helped a lot to understand that he had a choice. He either had to learn to lie or learn to be ignored and sidelined. That those were the choices for him when it came to establishing control over the Scottish government.
No, completely. I think, as you say, if you weren't savvy or lied or was strong, you would drown basically in that kind of environment.
Yeah, I mean, and it had drowned several of his ancestors, and it would drown his son. Charles the First was not a skilled liar, and but, ultimately, I think fatally.
So during James's teens, he becomes quite close to his relative Esme Stuart,
Yes.
and he becomes quite politically involved in Scottish politics. Was he liked by the Scottish government?
No, he was, well, that's probably not fair. He was initially liked by half of them. And so Esme is the cousin of James's late father. And initially, he is brought to Scotland. He'd been born in France. His father had gone to France when he was a young man. And Esme has attended the French court. He served in the household of James's godfather, King Charles IX of France. And he is brought over because, as I mentioned, there'd been sort of a run of bad luck in James's family, and he will one day be the next Earl of Lennox, which has a lot of land and a lot of money and a lot of influence in Scottish aristocratic society. So I think for me the plan was that Esme was going to take the Lennox earldom at some point, and that James hoped to recruit him as an ally. And he had been trying to do this. If you look at people he's appointed as captain of the guard, prominent figures in and around the household, they're all relatives as close as he can get them, really. And Esme is one of the closest. The other one is their mutual, well, Esme's uncle and James's great uncle, the Earl of March. And Esme's brought over, and he had been quite friendly with James's mother when she lived in France. And he's in his 30s, he's very intelligent, very stylish. He, I think in many ways, he becomes exaggerated almost as if he's sort of this malign genius. And he was neither of those things. He was someone of above average intelligence who was very well connected. But crucially, Esme, when he was in France, had become quite friendly with a lot of Scottish aristocrats who had had to come to France because they'd fallen out with James's regent, Lord Morton, who James had also come to distrust. So Esme arrives in Scotland with his opinions firmly against Morton, and he encourages James in this. Then James invites him to stay, and Esme is really sort of jumped on as a useful ally by many of his other relatives in Scotland. So there is a solid base of support for him. There are people around Morton who don't like him. Now, one of the enduring stories about Esme is that there was some kind of sexual relationship between Esme and James, which, even in that context, and certainly in ours, would have been exploitative and abusive, given the age gap, and also the fact that Esme was married and that he was in a sort of not in a senior social position, but certainly in an emotional position. And I had sort of gone into this under the impression that that might have been the case because I'd read the quotes in other works about him. And one of the things that struck me was that no one close to James, including those who absolutely loathed Esme, ever insinuated that that had happened. And when I went to find where these sources had come from, that there had been a sexually exploitative relationship between them, I found them in other sources that were sort of public rumor mills, and that Esme in the same source, and these parts, excuse me, are not usually quoted, is accused of being an atheist and or a Catholic spy. He's a kidnapper. He secretly runs a brothel. There are lurid stories told about him as a sort of figure of heterosexual vice and promiscuity. And actually, it's pretty similar to what's said about David Rizzio and Mary Queen of Scots in the previous generation. And so for me, looking at it, it became clear that actually this is not what I thought it was. These are sources from people who had no idea. And when you have people, I mean, who really detested Esme and knew the couple, the couple of men and Esme and his wife Catherine very well, there's no insinuation from them at all that this was happening. So there's no doubt there was a strong emotional attachment there from James. But what I find quite interesting is he gives him all his father's former titles and his grandfather's. So Esme is really set up to be a sort of dynastic figure in Scotland. And he seems to think it's all gonna that this has worked. And he begins plans to bring his wife Catherine, the Countess of Lennox, over to Scotland. She's going to bring their five children. Their plans set up for a household. James signs off on permission for Catherine Lennox to hear mass when she comes. She's still a Catholic. Esme converts to Presbyterianism. But While Esme is successful in backing a coup that gets rid of Lord Morton, it very soon becomes clear that now that they've gotten rid of Morton, people are starting to get jealous of Esme. And in particular, a lot of the people who had helped educate James are now worried that he's surrounding himself with relatives who weren't there to bring him up, but are going to be there to cash in when he comes into adulthood. So that really is the point at which Esme becomes very unpopular with the rest of the Scottish government.
With Esme being so unpopular, another figure that tried to get herself back into Scottish government was James's mother, Mary.
Hmm.
And you quite rightly dispelled in this book that James didn't have a lot of affection for his mother as it's put about.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised reading some of their letters and also crucially some of his actions when she was under threat of death. And his relationship with her is confusing because I think it was confusing to him. He, at times, he does say in an extraordinary letter to Elizabeth's favorite, Robert Dudley, where he says, religion does divide us and it always will. But the idea that he felt nothing for her is completely untrue. And looking through some of the private papers to find out how he reacted when she was executed, and also the quite surprising lengths he went to save her life when she was under threat after the Babington plot, was really remarkable. And I've written about Elizabeth I before, and to me, she's still an incredibly impressive figure. There's a lot more pluses for me with Elizabeth I than there is minuses. But one of the exciting things about writing a biography is that you will be looking at it from someone else's perspective. And in Queen James, Elizabeth is sort of off stage in a way. He never meets her, although she's very influential in his life. And from James's perspective, I could see why he found her um, patronizing and annoying and at times belittling and rude. So that was quite a fun thing to sort of see such a famous figure as Elizabeth from a different perspective.
I mean, yeah, I think it is obviously we see a lot of the Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots from Elizabeth's side. Obviously, I live in
Yeah.
England, so I see it a lot from Elizabeth's point of view. But I think it was interesting to see how James was advised, you need to keep Elizabeth on side because really you're our only potential heir compared to everyone else.
He's the only one who wouldn't have had, I mean, there were other claimants, you're right, but he was the only one who wouldn't have had multiple other claimants seriously threatening him. And one thing I was very determined on when I started this book was that it wasn't going to be Scotland as a prologue. I hate that. And he spent just over half his life in Scotland, so just over half the book focuses on his time in Scotland. And when you look at what is happening from the Scottish perspective in the 1580s and the 1590s, it looks very different. And that for me was exciting and quite enjoyable to research and write about.
So I think it's fair to mention that when James turns 18 or 19, that he possibly begins a relationship with Patrick Gray.
Yeah.
What was their sort of dynamic? Do we know what their dynamic was?
Patrick's probably the one that we know the least about in terms of the private dynamic, partly because he did also work as a spy. So a lot of Patrick's private papers, I imagine either never existed or were destroyed. We're lucky in that Patrick was a man of quite exceptional good looks, which means that there are some contemporary comments about the sort of preeminently beautiful Scottish nobleman. He's about 4 or 5 years older than James. He spent time in France. Um, Patrick's really interesting because he is the first favorite for whom there is a rapid ascent through the royal household, whereas James has previously only um, done that with relatives. And there are rumors. You start to hear talk about that there are people in the royal household and in the bedchamber, and in particular Patrick, who are too influential. With Patrick, we don't have um, private letters from when they were happy. We have letters between them, quite remarkable letters when it looks like things are beginning to buckle apart. And certainly the tone of that is much more personal than between a king and a subject. But you also have to let your reader make up their own mind. You can't take the evidence beyond what is there. All you can say is that there were suspicions. There are letters between them when things are tense that would suggest that the relationship had always been beyond king and subject, and that Patrick was the favorite until, Patrick's sort of double dealings and the fact he is kind of a victim of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, really, and that was interesting. James had sent Patrick on a diplomatic mission to England. He entrusts a lot of secret messages to him. Obviously, the mission fails, and it's Patrick. That's really the end of the relationship with Patrick, and he was such an interesting figure because he exists. I don't think he was a terribly deep person, Patrick. It's interesting that seems to be a recurring thought about him for the rest of his life. And certainly, yes, I think he got along quite a bit on how good looking he was, but I do also get this sense of someone who was very charming. And and also, even someone like Patrick, for him, there don't seem to be a lot of voices raised to say nice things about him. You will often find details that are surprising and humanizing, one of which is that he was a really devoted son and sort of gave up the chance of another courtly career in France after things ended with James, so that he could come home and look after his father when he was sick. So, I mean, I'm about to say shades of grey, which is a ridiculous pun, I would say, because of Patrick's surname, but he does. Everyone has shades of grey.
Yeah, I found Patrick to be quite multi-layered in different ways. Obviously, he's a spy, and
Yeah.
that doesn't give him a credit. And I think maybe James was looking for someone to blame, and when it came to the execution of his mother, because you do that when you're grieving, possibly.
I think that's a fair suggestion. I mean, there are letters where he retreats to the countryside to grieve, and he specifically says Patrick especially is not to come here. So I do think yes, Patrick is blamed.
James's second love is Alexander Lindsay, and
Yes.
in the book you describe him as the personality of a golden retriever.
Yeah, I think I said that in one of the interviews. Yeah, he does. I think he did have the personality of a gold. I mean, he was just a nice person. It's quite, I mean, the quote I use in the book was a lovely one, which is lightsome Lindsay. And which was his one of his nicknames. And I think people, his family were the Lindsays, Clan Lindsay, and they sort of fell into two camps. The joke about the Lindsays was that either they were very aggressive or they were lovely. And Alexander, excuse me, was just a nice person. No one really seems to have a problem with him, which is quite rare in 16th century court politics, in fact, almost unheard of. And it seems to have been a very happy relationship, and it's the first one that we have letters between the two of them, and we have clear evidence of closeness, and also that there is outright consensus among people close to them, including a mutual friend called Lord Hume, who are convinced that it's a romantic relationship. But marriage it will come for them all, and James is getting to marital age at this point. In fact, he's probably slightly over it. He's heading into his closer to his mid-20s than early 20s, and this is the first point when he's in a relationship with another Scottish nobleman called, as you say, Alexander Lindsay, that for the first time the Scottish public start to talk about him, and there are even protests pushing him to announce a marriage. So I think it's around the relationship with Alexander Lindsay, which is ballpark around the time of the Spanish Armada, that you start to really see public speculation about James's private life, and the king behaving in a way that confirms those pieces of speculation.
Obviously, a massive figure in James's life is Queen Anna, Anna of Denmark.
Yes,
Absolute legend. It's
love her,
she's absolutely
love her.
fantastic. James marries her in 1590.
Yep,
1590. How is that? Does James try to at least make an effort in their relationship?
very much so. And this surprised me. I could not find any evidence for about 5 or 6 years of even whispers of rumors about other favorites. And in fact, to be honest, really firm sources do not appear until about 9 or 10 years into the marriage. So I will caveat that by saying that that does not mean that it didn't happen, and the sources may simply have been lost. There may have been flings that meant so little or were so secretive that no one recorded them. That being said, considering that there is such a decent amount of um, paperwork, if you like, evidence for earlier favorites and certainly for later ones, that there's nothing in the 1590s really surprised me. And you can't really base um, evidence or conclusions are in personality rather than evidence. And what this led me to conclude is that James did not stray and really tried to make the marriage work. I think he really liked her. I think there was a huge amount of affection and a kind of love, maybe not passionate love, but certainly love between him and Anna of Denmark. And this is borne out a little bit by some of the behavior right before they get married. When the protests are happening in Edinburgh, James retreats to one of his countryside palaces and spends 2 weeks every day in prayer, asking God to guide him towards marriage. And he makes a lot of effort that I go into the book, I think, to make this work. And she is someone with such a palpable, charismatic, forceful personality. I mean, I just loved her. And I don't know, maybe one day I'd write a biography of her because I think she absolutely merits one. So yes, and yet the children come along and they do quarrel, and Anna is more than a match for him when it comes to arguments. But that being said, I never got the impression that they were anything other than allies. The major fight is not over his male favorites, it's over how do they bring up their eldest son, Prince Henry, who's born in 1594. And Anna wants him brought up in the way children are brought up in the Danish royal family, which is with their parents. And James wants a very tight control around Henry at Stirling because, as he explains to Anna, I do not want him to be used as a pawn against me the way I was used against my poor mother, is how he puts it. So, really, I think what the tensions in their marriage, in and around, I mean, 1595 is the worst year in their marriage by quite a mark, 5 years in. This is a little bit reductive, but I don't think misleadingly so. I think the reason for the tensions are you are seeing the clash between someone who had a happy childhood, which is Anna, and someone who had an unhappy childhood, which is James, and they just have completely different worldviews on how a royal child should be brought up. So it's not a uniformly happy marriage. Um, but I would say it really isn't until about 1600 that you start to see James, I think, lose a battle with his own sexuality.
No, I agree. I think in the book, especially, I got the point that James did really try, and he to dispel rumors more than anything. Because obviously, as you said before marriage, people are starting to talk. You know what's going on.
Yeah, and he does say at one point that that hurt him. He's very open about that in some of his writings that he was really humiliated by it, by that speculation. As I say, I cannot, if you were writing a novel and you included a scene where there was like a one night stand or something covered up, that could be credible. But from a biographer's perspective, there just is no evidence between about 1590 and 1600 of him with another man.
Another big part of what is talked about when it comes to James is his obsession with witches and demonology.
Hmm.
And in 1590/91, we have the Berwick witch trials. What was James's involvement in this specifically?
More complex, but no less tragic than what you usually heard. I was really shocked by the fact that he initially thought they were nonsense, and he took no interest in them. And he was convinced logically, I mean, he was a very intelligent man, that of course these poor people had confessed to witchcraft, they'd been tortured. And he was under an immense amount of pressure and criticism, particularly from the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. There were sermons preached when he was in church telling him that he wasn't doing enough in the morality crusade against satanic activity in Scotland. He's also under less, but nonetheless, real pressure from his Danish in-laws, who have also uncovered, they claim, covens in Denmark and Norway. So when Anna was coming to Scotland, she was nearly drowned several times in what even the admiral in charge of her fleet called the worst storms he'd ever seen. And he was a Scandinavian admiral who'd been to sea many times. There is various local witch hunts in Scotland that start to collide with this growing paranoia coming in from Scandinavia that these storms were unnatural in their ferocity and therefore unnatural in their origin. And James resists and resists, and then eventually, to kind of, I think, shut it down, says that he will meet and question some of the primary suspects himself. And there is a remarkable moment when one of the, now I should point out, she had been horrifically tortured. How much James knew about that, I don't know, but certainly she had been. And that's relevant for us as readers and writers. She refused to back down. She kept insisting that she was a witch, and she said allegedly certain things to him that were so specific that he was convinced. And I have an appendix at the end of the book where I talk about what kind of language I use for sexuality and also for beliefs in magic. And one of the things that I can never explain in a historical book why Agnes Sampson said what she said, how she knew what she knew. And in many ways, it's a pointless waste of time. In the same way, it would be like if I was sitting here and really believed in tarot cards and you really didn't. And you will meet people who will tell you that they got a very specific, accurate reading, and other people who will think that it's cold body language reading, all the rest of it. All you can really do with these things is point out that there were clear cases in the North, in the witch trials of the 1590 and 1591 when the statements of victims are massaged and manipulated by people with their own goals. And there also are instances when, if it's dark and stormy and you are frightened, you might be nudged into believing it. And this is more of a modern terminology, but genuinely, that what seems to happen is James has some sort of psychotic break. I mean, it's like a different person takes over, and even some of the people closest to him, Anna, Alexander Lindsay, who you mentioned earlier, the retriever, and Lightsome Lindsay, and his cousin Ludovic, the Duke of Lennox, are three of the people, probably his best friend, his first love, and his wife, and they are all. So Alexander Lindsay comes back to court to try and talk James out of this because James seems to have lost his mind. And he won't listen. He is convinced that there is a satanic plot in Scotland to kill him. So he, in those trials in 1590 and 1591, is a reluctant participant who becomes, I think, a vindictive cheerleader. It's not true, though, that that lasts. And in 1597, he steps in to shut down another witch hunt, and he does the same in England in 1616. And he actually, there was a quote I came across from the son of someone who worked for James, and they said, oh, by the end of it, by the end of his life, he was much more inclined to believe that witch hunts were fraudulent. I don't, that to me, that might be a little bit of an overstatement. And certainly, while James does intervene to shut down later witch hunts, there's only one thing that he does that really has an impact on preventing future ones, which is that in 1597 he abolishes a committee, a standing committee that had been set up to permanently investigate witchcraft in Scotland. And obviously, if you have a committee like that, you're going to have more victims, more investigations. He does, however, write a very famous book, which is Demonology, in which he defends witch hunts. And I think that was no, I think I was going to say that it's one of his more damning legacies. I actually think his involvement in the witch hunt in 1591 is the worst thing he did. But the Demonology book, even though James moves on and changes his mind, that book is still in circulation and it does an immense amount of damage because it's quite well written. And it knocks down. It basically is going after the arguments that mock witch hunts, and in some in a very dark way. It's a little bit like celebrity sit down tell all interviews, and they do them and then they want to move on, but th those quotes will be with them for the rest of their lives, and the public might not move on as quickly as you do. And to me, demonology is like that with James. He writes it, he then changes his mind, but it's in circulation for decades after he dies. So that's why I say it's more complex than I think the idea that he was just an obsessive witch hunter. But the impact is no less tragic. And certainly, chapter 8 in the book is focused on those witch hunts and his role in them. And it was horrific and at times deeply upsetting to be researching it. And it was a chapter I was happy to leave because the the palpable horror of what was inflicted on the victims is you can it's there in the sources. You can feel these were the fear and the agony that was inflicted.
No, yeah, I mean, I read that chapter late at night and I was like, I need to watch something happy now because this is really depressing.
Yeah, yeah, it was depressing. And it just it in some ways actually I found it more frightening that he initially thought it was rubbish. There's something even more frightening about this was someone who knew that the torture might get likely got false confessions, but he could still be bounced by fear into becoming a bloodthirsty advocate for it. And that maybe is a lesson to throughout time that skeptics can be turned, even people who should know better.
Who is James's next love? Obviously, he's been, as we know, quite loyal to Anna. Who
Mhm.
catches his eye?
There is a man called Alexander Riven, a member of the Scottish aristocracy, and there's a lot of speculation that will follow James, and it really does break out into the public speculation. There are people talking about it in England, in France. It's a very controversial one, trying to write that chapter in the book when there's so much. Sort of don't want to give too much away because even trying to explain it in brief is a lot, but there's a lot of scandal, and James interestingly, when Elizabeth dies in 1603 and he goes to England, his next love is almost the opposite of Alexander Ribbon. He picks a member of a Welsh aristocratic family, Lord Philip Herbert, who James will make Earl of Montgomery. And Philip is very handsome, sort of more brawn than brain. Everyone sort of quite likes Philip, but he's not overburdened with intelligence, and he's completely apolitical. I mean, he has a brother, the Earl of Pembroke, who's very involved in the Protestant, we might say Puritan faction at James's court. Philip takes nothing to do with it. And by this point, Anna knows, and she's sort of on board with it. Her and James, I think, have settled into a friendly relationship, and she demands really pretty much a blank checkbook and unlimited respect from the court, which he is prepared to give her. And Philip was another apolitical interlude for 4 years, and I was very fortunate that there's not. I mean, I don't think Philip wrote a lot of letters. He said he hated writing, but I was quite lucky in that I found accounts from family friends about it. And and even from some people who worked for the family who would say quite funny, sort of, in many ways, sort of touchingly naive things, like the king seems to have forgotten Philip's gender and treats him like a woman. Like they couldn't quite get their head around this. Other people very much knew that he hadn't made a mistake. But Philip is there for 4 years, and I don't think it's a relationship of great passion. I think I mean, actually, family friends say it began because Philip was fun and really handsome and good at hunting, and James likes all three of those things. And then in 1607, James meets at a joust a young Scottish nobleman called Robert Carr, and courtiers refer to him as the new comet. And he streaks across the sky, and Philip sort of wins James's everlasting gratitude by leaving with no drama. And Philip just doesn't really sort of Teflon when it comes to scandal and drama. Nothing really sticks to him. But that will not be the case with Robert.
No, Robert is. It was an interesting fellow to read about, especially at the end of his
Yeah,
ascendancy, and he involved himself a lot in politics and made enemies as well.
he did, and he wasn't any more intelligent than Philip. And I think, you know, one of those quotes that sails perilously close to a live, laugh, love poster. But I always think, know thyself, know what your strengths are, know what your weaknesses are. And Robert forgot that he wasn't clever enough to do this. And early in the relationship, it was like writing about two different people. I mean, they were together for a long time. They were together really for the guts of a decade. And in the first, let's say, 3 to 4 years, Robert doesn't touch politics. He kind of treads that route that Philip did. But for a variety of reasons, he gets himself involved in politics in the early 1610s, and he is hopelessly unsuited for it. And to be honest, Jess, it was like writing about two different people. I mean, Robert, I would say, by the end, was my least favorite of the men James was involved with. I just thought he was utterly appalling. And actually, I think potentially psychologically, um, again, I'm hesitant to use the word abuse, but I don't think it's a million miles off when, he was shaking James awake at night to start an argument, and James was exhausted, and there was a lot of mental game playing. So, and what I will say for fans of primary sources, James writes a 7-page letter to Robert in which he goes into detail about how heartbroken he is. And that was a really moving thing to read because it was so personal and you can feel the heartbreak. But Robert, I suppose, is a great cautionary tale, which is that sometimes fame and fortune brings out the worst in people. And maybe that's who he'd always been. Or maybe it corrupted him. I don't know. Did it create a monster or did it enable a monster? But and sometimes as an author, biographer, you hope you feel a bit greedy about your subject and sort of there'll be a good buffet of stories. And the stories of Robert's downfall, I mean, he calls one of the great scandals of the 17th century is, I mean, it's worth a TV series in its own right, I think. And that was great fun and going into it. And so, yeah, to me, Robert Carr is a story of hubris. If you wanted to be really mean, you would say Pinocchio thought he was a real boy, and then that I think I think he had a lot of puppet masters, and then he thought he could do it on his own.
Yeah, I think he became very corrupted by the end. I
Mhm.
mean, when I was reading about how he would start arguments and he was screaming at the king, and
Yeah.
you're reading James trying to calm him down, it's almost like he forgot who was the king of England.
Completely. I think that's such a fair point, Jess, and that is something that George Villiers does not do. The next one, and we have this idea of George as being much more manipulative and corrupt than Robert was, and I don't think he was lacking in a sprinkling of corruption or a flair for manipulation. But George, there's only once that George oversteps the mark and it's an argument over foreign policy. Whereas Robert, but then I suppose writing about, I mean, look, I say at the start of the book, this is not solely a personal life because even if I was writing a biography of King Charles III today or King Frederick X or any of our current constitutional monarchs, I couldn't leave politics out of it. They're inextricably linked. The personal life is a framing device for this. And also, I think it gives me a chance to really focus on some fabulous sources that haven't really got the light of day before. But from those arguments, as horrible as they sound, it does seem to me pretty clear that actually within that relationship between James and Robert, social status had either been inverted or forgotten, which makes it seem much more personal to us.
Yeah, I think as well, Robert seems to have lost interest in James
Yes. Yeah.
much earlier than James did. James is still trying, even when he's kind of getting interest into George.
Yeah, I think James, I mean, George is making a play for James, and he has some very powerful backers at court who just, I mean, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, who decides to throw the prayer book out the window and says, we need one nail to drive the other one out. And George is going to be this nail. But really, as smitten as James is with George, the priority is still Robert. And it as much as I don't like Robert, again, as with Patrick, I will defend him and say if he had wanted to recapture everything, I think he could have resumed the sexual relationship. And James is very clear in the letters that Robert had stopped that. And maybe it is, I think it is, to Robert's credit that actually it means that when they were sleeping together, it was sincere and genuine. And that in that area, at least, that very personal core area, he was not playing a game.
Who planned Robert's downfall? How was his downfall brought?
Robert's downfall is really by himself and by his wife. And they have, again, it's like Alexander Riven. I won't go into it too much. It is all in the book, but again, it's like you almost can't do it justice in 3 sentences. But there is a lot of speculation about how they have dealt with their enemies and how they have amassed their money. And Robert is not exactly on the charm offensive in 1613 and 1614. There are a lot of people who have come to dislike them, but the two most important are, as I mentioned, the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, and also Queen Anna, who, as I mentioned earlier, so forgive me for repeating myself, is a big believer in respect. And she's not someone who thinks it's equally given. She is the queen, and they need to remember that. And so if she laughs at them, as she does very often at Robert, he doesn't get to laugh back. And Robert is starting to sort of sass back a little bit. And Anna hates, I mean, by this point, he is quite unlikable anyway. And Anna and the Archbishop ally, and they spot George Villiers with a friend of the family. He's come to court. George, the first thing everyone, including people who hate him, comment on is how good looking he is. And so Anna starts casting him in her masquerades. They start trying to get him a job in the king's household. It's really Anna and the Archbishop who I think are responsible for putting George center stage in the court. So they are responsible for George's rise, which happens almost at the same time as Robert's downfall. But the downfall is Robert's fault. And Robert, once the scandals start to erupt, Robert does not behave like someone who has nothing to hide. And so it does end up with public humiliation and even court cases.
How does George kind of smooth things over when Robert's downfall is going on and he has the king's ear?
George is a calming influence. He will certainly feather his own nest. He does become immensely wealthy. He actually becomes more influential than any of the rest of them. And after Queen Anne's death in 1619, to all intents and purposes, George functions like a consort. But in the immediate aftermath of Robert's downfall, George is the one who I think tries to keep James on an even keel emotionally. It's very upsetting for James and quite frightening that all these scandals are happening in public view. So that I think is how George does it. I mean, he does it by how sort of soothing and calm and clever he is.
In their letters, obviously, I think some of their letters are some of the most detailed insight
Yeah.
into their relationship, and it does appear very genuine.
Yeah, they're a wonderful source basket, if you like, because you put your hand in and you will get a letter that's about politics. You will get ones that are very, very romantic, and actually it's sometimes quite sweet. And there are also some saucy ones there that are very biologically explicit about what they're getting up to sexually. So it's a fully rounded picture. And yes, I did think that. I mean, when you have James writing to him and saying, I had to ride away from everyone today because you have left me. George had gone on a diplomatic mission to Spain. James had to leave because the tears are trickling down my face. I don't want anyone to see, and I care for nothing more in the whole world, but you will be in my arms again. And then George sends back letters asking, "Oh, do you love me as much as the first night we shared a bed?" So yes, I do. It's difficult because George's whole livelihood, he doesn't come from money. He comes from an old upper class family, but there's no money left. George's whole livelihood depends on this relationship with James. So it's not equal in the way that we could ever conceive of it. But I do think, particularly when I was writing the last chapter when James is dying, that George's reaction when he's sort of sitting by the bedside sobbing as James is becoming more and more ill, I do think actually there was genuine affection and passion there.
George was quite politically savvy. What
Hmm.
I found interesting was how Charles, James's son, didn't like him at first.
Yeah, I mean, most favorites in history are victims of regime change. You don't usually find one that moves from one reign into the next. And George, I think, was savvy and knew that one day James would die and that his son Charles would be Charles the First. So he sets out to win his friendship, and he's very successful. And Charles almost thinks of him like an older brother or a stepbrother or something, or maybe even a step parent. But we don't really know. I searched and searched, and there's really only one comment in one of Charles's letters that to me seems to hint that he knew what the dynamic was between George and his father, but it's not enough to make a firm guess.
How far did George rise in James's reign? Did he get lots of titles?
He went through all of them. He went from Baron to Duke, which is all five of them, Duke of Buckingham, and he becomes Lord High Admiral. So he is a major political figure and also the highest ranking aristocrat in the land. There's no other duke at this stage. They don't recreate the Dukedom of Norfolk, excuse me, until later in the century. So no, so he is one step outside the royal family, and it's not a big step.
As you mentioned, George was by James's deathbed as he was slowly dying. What was the aftermath of James's death? Kind of, what was George's position after that?
George remains immensely influential politically under Charles I. Unfortunately, as Lord High Admiral, he is blamed, and I think not unfairly. He did support this war in Europe that leads to a lot of economic upset. And in 1628, partly because of his notoriety as James's alleged lover, and partly because he's being scapegoated, again, not totally unfairly, for this war, he is assassinated. He's stabbed to death at Portsmouth in 1628. So violence comes for him in the end.
I think it's a question I always ask at the end of my podcast is
Yeah,
what sort of legacy did James leave?
gosh, it's hard even to unpack it. What a great question. His legacy is enormous. I'm in Northern Ireland, which in many ways has as high a Protestant population as it does because of James's policies. Long ago, he was the first king to unite, not legislatively, but royally, the British Isles. The King James Bible, peace with Spain, the fact that he didn't really have an American policy in many ways, the way the empire develops in the Americas it's allowed to develop that way because James doesn't really do anything to control how it moves and mutates. Um, an extraordinary, multifaceted, often very painful political legacy. He does deserve credit for keeping Britain out of one of the bloodiest wars in European history, the 30 Years' War, which he was loathed for at the time and was nicknamed Queen James, partly because of his private life and partly because of his aversion to war, which is why I chose the title, because in many ways those two things today are what make him interesting and likable to us. The nickname no longer seems like an insult. And on a personal level, the fact that we have such explicit, romantically, sexually, personally explicit letters between a king and a male lover is it'd be all beyond unusual. So personally, he left a legacy of rich detail and politically one of many nuances.
No, I agree. I've come away from the book really admiring James. To be honest, I know he's got faults. Everybody's got
Absolutely.
faults, but I think he's incredible. To be fair to him.
I think he was a remarkable man with an even more remarkable life. So I would agree. I think the flaws were enormous, but the strengths were many.
Before I let you go, as you know, I like to ask five
Yes.
fun history questions. So, have you got a new pet peeve since last time we spoke?
Uh, no, not. I mean, I suppose I do have. I mean, if I might, it irritates me when makes me sound so curmudgeonly, but sort of like the Instagrammers when they present. Did you know that in ancient Egypt they say some fact that you're just is absolute blankety blank nonsense. So yeah, 20-second non-facts on social media are my new pet peeve.
No, I agree. I saw something the other day. I think it was, what was it? Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's miscarriage was caused by Jane Seymour in 1536. I was like, wow, where do we get that from?
It's I hate it. It's like my doom scrolling becomes a lot faster.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
I probably, to be honest, after writing this book, possibly the room at the top of the Gowrie Tower
Mm,
in 1600 to see what happened that day between him and Alexander Riven.
yeah, I've, that's a mystery that needs to be
Yeah,
solved.
yeah.
Have you got a favorite historical book?
Yes, mine is called Midnight at the Pera Palace. It is a book by an American historian called Charles King, and it is about a hotel in Istanbul between the First and Second World Wars, and it's brilliant. I absolutely love it. And also set, and the other one is the trilogy on Byzantium, also strangely set in Istanbul when it was in Constantinople by John Julius Norwich.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Anne Boleyn, morning, noon, and night. I think the curiosity would kill me. Otherwise, I couldn't. To see what that charm was, to see what it was about her that made her so compelling, and also, I mean, like to be honest, I'd be like, listen, I have a theory about when you were born. I hope it's not rude. How old are you? And also, just take a look at her, and then be able to play bowling, take out the pins with the portraits when I got back. So I have a lot. Anne Boleyn, without question.
And finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
King James had a pet armadillo that he liked to walk around the grounds of his hunting lodge.
I mean, what a fact.
Magnificent.
Thank you so much for coming back
My
and
pleasure. Thanks for
discussing your new
having me.
book. I mean, it's fantastic. I will put a link for my listeners down below to buy it because you need to, frankly.
Well, thank Jess, and also just really thank you for those brilliant questions. It's a real pleasure to sit and talk to someone who has enjoyed the book and has. Thank you. Really appreciated the interview.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.